And we are live. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Pixelpalooza. It's Jonas here again, and I'm joined here with my great colleague Magnus, who will be operating the camera and the technical sides of this webinar. I'm very excited to see so many of you coming back to learn more about Pixeltope. Before we begin, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our setup, just so we can make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to why we've set it up that way. So Magnus, can you enable the extra webcam feed? As you can see, we currently are outputting 3 different signals. We have the webcam with me, and then we have another webcam stream on that side, which is a webcam feed of the monitor, and we have one for a screen capture of the actual monitor. And the reason why we do it this way is because the internet is kind of overloaded these days because of obvious reasons. So the frame rate on the webcam feed is very good, but the resolution is not great. And the resolution on the screen capture feed is pretty good, but the frame rate on that screen is not very good. So that's why we have 2 outputs, so you can see the kind of the snappy performance on the webcam feed. And then you can make out the actual interface on the screen capture. And I will also try to slow down the session a little bit just to make sure that you can catch whatever I'm doing on the screen. We have also added an extra widget that allows us to record keystrokes and actions on the screen, so it's easier to follow along. So with that out of the way, I think we are ready to begin this session. This session is going to be about creative workflows and best practices. So once again, I'm Jonas. I'm a CG artist at the Future Group. Let's get that out of the way. So today we'll talk about workflows, and we'll talk about the usage of a style guide, best practices. I'm going to dive into some PBR goodness, and we'll talk about version control. And then one important note about today is that multi-machine is moved till Tuesday next week. So we will not be covering multi-machine setup today. That is moved till Tuesday next week. All right, so once again, session overview for today. We're going to talk about a vendor spec sheet, what that is, and why would you would want to have one. Sorry. We're going to talk about why it's important to have a real-time mindset when working with Pixeltope to get the most out of it. And we're going to talk about PBR, which is the way you shade materials inside Unreal. We're going to talk about importing source files, talk about style guides, and then talk about source control. Not necessarily going to be in this order, but we're going to cover all of those topics. And once again, multi-machine setup is moved to Tuesday. So first of all, let's talk about a vendor spec sheet. So what is a vendor spec sheet? It's basically a document defining the entire aspect of your assets creation and workflows. And it also helps you organize your project as well as defining your style guide and which style guide you are using for the project. It also gives you an overview of optimization and performance, and we'll have a session on Monday talking about optimization and performance. We also have an example of what a vendor spec sheet might look like. I'm going to open up this creative vendor specifications example. So this is kind of a suggestive guide and how a vendor spec sheet like this would look like. But it's basically a document that explains the workflows and the asset creation and style guides and product structure and all of that in one single document. If you wish to have this example document available, let us know and we can send that to you. But this is basically this vendor spec sheet. So let's switch back to my presentation here. All right. let's talk a little bit about project structure and style guides and source control. So what is a style guide? We touched a little bit about that. A style guide is kind of mentioned inside the vendor spec sheets. And a style guide is basically a guide that gives you all the naming conventions, folder structure, and how you should set up your project to make it organized and clean. And this is why you should use a style guide. It doesn't matter which style guide you use, you should find one and stick to it. This is very important. If you're working as a big team, several people working on the same project, you should all follow this same style guide. Be strict about it. Don't accept any slippage. This is very important because when you get close to a broadcast, you don't want to mess around in a project that has multiple files that you have no idea what they do because they are not named correctly and they're not existing in the correct folders. So what we do, so the style guide that we use at TFG is based on one that's called the LR style guide. This is a very common style guide used for Unreal projects. So this is basically just a list of all the folder structure, as well as the naming conventions for various assets inside the project. You can see, for example, we have M underscore. For materials, we have M underscore and then the name. For textures, we have T underscore, then the name, and then the texture type. As well as static meshes, we start with S as the prefix, then underscore name, and then underscore version. So not meaning version as in terms of that this you import multiple versions inside Unreal because Pixelstop, so you shouldn't really do that. What you should do when getting things into Unreal is to import the final version of that asset. When it comes to creating version controls of the source assets, that's a different style guide for source assets and a specific style guide for the actual Pixelstop project. Sorry, that was the wrong one. Let's see. Sorry, I seem to have lost my, oh, there it is. Right. So what you can take away from this is be organized and don't be lazy. Basically, don't break the style guide. Stick to the style guide, and if you're working on a project that has an existing style guide in it, then stick to that style guide. Don't break it. Be organized and be efficient, basically. When it comes to testing out stuff, doing R&D, and just playing around with things, it's okay to put all of that stuff in dev folders or sandbox folders, but just keep it there and don't use any of that stuff for the final project. Everything should be nice and clean. So when we have all of this, how can we use applications in order to help us out to organize all of this and make our life a little bit easier? For that, we can use a source control application or version control, depending on what you want to call it. So we use Perforce. So this is Perforce, which is basically allows you to have a file system that is locked to this software, which basically allows you to lock files to specific computers. And I can easily showcase this by, you can see I have my Pixelstop exterior example project open in Perforce. And it gives me a list of all the folders and the files. And I can right click on any one of those files and hit check out and hit OK. This means that this file is now locked to my computer and no one else can touch it. This project exists as a stream on a common server for everyone in our office, but I'm the only one that can actually access this now. If anyone else was to check out this file, I would see a blue marker on this file and I would be able to see which user and which computer is this file checked out from. And I would not be able to touch it until that user has the file checked back in. And to do that, you can just either you can hit submit to submit multiple files, and you can just right click on it and let's see, and hit submit. And you actually get the list of all the files anyway. The only difference is that if you hit submit up here, well, there actually isn't a difference. Okay. Anyways, so you hit submit to submit your files, give the description of what you actually changed in the file, and then just hit submit, and the file will be moved onto the stream, and everyone else will be able to update their project by hitting the root folder and hitting get latest. That means that Perforce is going to resync the project and update all the files that have been checked out and updated. So I can, I'm just going to revert this file because I haven't actually changed anything with it. So there's no point checking it back in as if I would do a change to it. So I'm just going to hit revert, and revert means that it's going to reset the file back to what it was before I checked it out. That's basically how you use Perforce, but you can also do this directly inside Pixitope. So if I open up a level inside the editor, let's give it a couple of seconds to load here. All right, anytime now. Here we are. So how you would do this inside Pixitope is that we need to connect this to Perforce. So what do you do? I'm just going to, it's already in here because I've already enabled source control on this one. But if I just check run without source control, it would reset it. So if you haven't enabled source control, you will get this little red icon here. You can just hit the button called source control and then connect to source control. Then you choose the source control application of your choice. Once again, we use Perforce, but you can see there are other alternatives available. I'm going to choose Perforce, and I'll choose the server that we're running Perforce on, username, and the workspace, which you can select here. You have the available workspaces to you, and accept settings. Now we are connected to source control, which means that we can do the same things that we did in Perforce, but we can do it right inside the Pixitope interface. So I can jump into, for example, art, find a prop. I can right click it, connect source control, select source control, and I can check out the file. Once again, this file is now locked to my computer. No one else can touch it until I submit it back in. And I can do that either by going to source control and check in. That will check in that single file. Or I can go to source control, submit, and I get the list of all the files I've checked out. I can write the description and submit that. And that will essentially do the same thing that I showed it in Perforce. Very exciting stuff, right? So I'm just going to revert this file because I haven't actually changed it. And this is very beneficial if you're working with multiple people working on the same project. Using source control will basically save your life in a lot of cases. Not only does it allow you to lock files to specific computers and users, it also keeps history. So you can revert back to a history if the project is for some reason completely messed up or otherwise corrupted. Then you can just roll it back to an earlier version, which is very handy. One final note on source control is that even though we're not going to talk about multi-machine setup today, there is one note about multi-machine setup where source control is very beneficial. Say that you have a production where you're running multiple Pixitope machines. So you have, for example, you have 4 Pixitope machines. And all of them are going to run the same project, but on a different camera, for example. You would then, without source control, you would then have to basically copy the project over from one computer every time you made a change, and that would be very time consuming. With source control, you can easily just work on the files, submit them, and then update them on the other computers very easily and painlessly. So I strongly recommend that you get a source control application for your projects, because it's going to save your life more often than you can imagine. So, and by the way, if there's anything I'm covering that you want to know more about, or you felt that it was unclear, feel free to ask a question inside the questions tab inside the webinar. Now, moving on, we're going to talk about PBR, real-time mindset, and importing source files. So what does it mean to have a real-time mindset? Well, when working with a real-time engine such as Pixitope, performance is very important. If you're not hitting the target frame rate when your broadcast goes live, the entire broadcast is ruined. So this is why it's crucial that you optimize your scenes to run properly. And we're going to cover more about scene optimization on Monday, but I'm going to cover now how you can optimize and prepare your assets before they go into the engine. And we'll cover modeling workflows, texture baking, and how you should prepare your UVs. And once again, this is something that you have to keep in mind when working with assets for Pixitope or any real-time engine. Is that you have to think about that you're making the asset for a game rather than a graphics. Because making things look good is only half of the equation. There are two important parts to creating assets for Pixitope. One is, of course, making it look as good as possible, but number two is making it look as good as possible, but also run as good as possible. So I'm going to demonstrate this, what I'm talking about, by opening up Blender, where we have a couple of example assets. So you can see here that we have this, hang on, I'm just going to close down the editor in the background here so we can actually get all the performance that we need. So inside Blender here, you can see that we have a couple of versions of this fire hydrant asset. Now, if I jump into wireframe mode, you can see that this high resolution asset is pretty dense when it comes to the poly count. So this is basically how you would start out your modeling. You would create the high polygon asset, but this is not suitable to bring into a real-time engine. It's way too dense. So what we need to do is to create a low polygon version of this, like we have down here. But as you can see with this one, we are losing a lot of the nice detail that this asset has. So what we need to do is to take the high resolution detail from this and somehow get it onto the low resolution model without adding extra geometry. Because when you model something, what you need to think about is that the only thing that matters when it comes to where you need to put your geometry is the silhouette. If something is not visible inside the silhouette, it means that it can probably be baked down into a texture. It's not necessary for it to be geometry. So if I jump back to this mode again, you can see, wireframe, you can see that these three fire hydrants have the same poly count, but this one has more detail. It has more of the high resolution detail, but this time it's inside the texture. So if I jump into edit mode, you can see that it doesn't really have that much detail inside the geometry. It's inside the actual texture maps. And this means that this asset looks, from a certain distance, it will look like identical to the high resolution asset, but it will run a lot better. And then you have the finished textured asset, where you can add even more micro detail by adding in more bumpy detail to the texture and all of those wear and tear textures, as well as dirt and grime and whatever you want inside the textures. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to jump into Substance Painter. And by the way, none of this is software specific. By the way, this is just to demonstrate how you can use, how you need to prepare your assets. This technique is possible in a variety of different software. Most 3D packages have the ability to bake down high resolution detail, but I'm going to showcase this in Substance Painter because that's where this asset was originally textured. So you can see we have the Studio Light. We have two versions of the Studio Light. We have the high resolution version over here, and we have the low resolution version. Actually, I'm getting a report that my keystrokes are not showing, so let's see. Okay, so it seems like we have some issues with the keystrokes application, so I'll try to just slow this down a little bit, and hopefully you will be able to follow along on the recording as well, at which will we provide to you. So back to texture baking. So of this Studio Light, we have, like I said, two versions, the high resolution one and the low resolution one. And once again, what we want is to bake down the detail of this high resolution one to this low resolution one. You can see this one has a lot of nice smooth bevels on the sharp edges, whereas this one does not. And we want to get that detail into this by baking down the texture. So what you need to make sure to prepare these assets for texture baking is that you need to make sure that this one is on the same position as this one. So when you model your low poly version of the high poly version, make sure that it maintains the volume. It doesn't need to maintain all the detail parts because that's obviously going to defeat the purpose, but you need to make sure that it maintains most of the volume of the model so that it's not going to project the texture in the wrong places. And then you can just select all of it and export it as an FBX or whatever your texture application takes in. For Substance Painter, it's divided into parts, and we have defined it with a suffix of _low for the low polygon assets and _high for the high resolution assets. I'm sorry if I'm using the term high resolution and high poly asset like randomly. It's like it means the same thing basically. So high resolution assets or high polygon assets, I'm using those terms like it means the same when I'm talking about this sort of texture baking stuff. Now you can see we have the different parts split up, and you want to export each of them separately, one as a high poly and one as a low poly. So I'm just going to close down Blender and bring up Substance Painter. All right, so I'm just going to, I'm just going to create a new one, just bring in our assets. And I have one right here. And I can choose the document resolution. Hit OK. Once again, this is not going to be an extensive look into Substance Painter because that's beyond the scope of this webinar. We're just going to talk about the texture baking. So now we have the low resolution assets. And now we can bake our textures. I'm going to go into this Bake Mesh Maps. I'm going to locate the high resolution assets, which I've named HP for high poly. And I'm going to make sure that Substance Painter is dividing the different meshes by mesh name, and that the suffixes for the different versions is high and low. And you can, of course, change this. So I'm just going to do a quick bake with a low resolution texture just to test that we don't have any specific artifacts. And if we do figure out that we have any artifacts in any of the maps, then we need to go back into Blender and fix those before we do the final baking. So let's say we're happy with this. I'm going to go back into it. I'm going to bake a 4K texture. So just give it a moment to bake. Obviously, this will take a little bit longer because it's a bigger texture, but it's not a very complex asset, so it shouldn't take too long. As you can see, it's baking a couple of different handy maps like this, and Substance Painter will combine all of these into the proper maps when we export it and bring it into Pixeltope. Most of these maps are utility maps that Substance Painter uses to generate its textures. So I'm gonna hit OK. We have a finished bake, and as you can see, we're getting that nice and crisp high resolution detail on our low poly mesh. If we check the wireframe, still the low poly mesh, we still have these sharp edges right here, but because the textures are baked onto it, we get this nice and smooth bevel. All right, so that's texture baking in a nutshell. You get high resolution detail down to low resolution detail. All right. I'm just going to close this, and I'm going to open up the finished textured file of that asset. Let's see. Give me a minute. There we go. All right. All right. Let's just enable the new shader because this one was made in an older version of Substance Painter, so it didn't display correctly. There we go. So you can see, this is the finished textured asset. It has both the high resolution detail that is baked down, and it has more micro detail from the textures. Very cool stuff. And Substance Painter will combine all of this into proper maps that we can use inside Pixeltope. Now, let's talk a little bit about PBR-based shading. A lot of the artists will probably already be familiar with this, but it's very important to keep in mind. Unreal uses a physically based shader system. And what this means is that it's using real physical properties in order to define a surface. So let's see if I can find the, just give me a second. I have some documentation here from Epic regarding PBR materials. I strongly encourage you to read up on this if you are interested in learning more about how a PBR material works and what that means. So I'm not going to go into depth of the scientific things behind it, but what you can think about with a PBR material is we can define it into two main groups, and that being a metallic material and a dielectric material. And a dielectric material basically means it's non-metallic. So it's very easy to split them up that way. And a physically based shader is also split down into very few parameters, so they're very easy to set up. You have the base color, the roughness, the metallic value, and the specular. And if we jump back into Substance Painter, we can see how all of these properties are defined and create our different surfaces inside one single material. If I open up a new layer here, I'm just going to quickly set this one to replace everything, so just so I can demonstrate what this means. Just give me a second. And here we go. So we have the base color, which is only going to be the colors. Pretty simple. The height value is going to be the extra bump detail that you add into the software, and then Substance Painter will combine it with the high resolution detail that you baked. And the roughness defines how rough a material is. The more roughness, the more diffuse the material will be. The less roughness, the more shiny it will be, and in turn more reflective. If I turn up the metallic value, it will mean that I turn it from a dielectric material to a metallic material. So when it comes to materials, like I said, there are two groups. It's either dielectric or it's metallic. But for the most part, it's either one or the other, which means that it's either 0% metallic or it's 100% metallic. You can see now it looks more like a proper metallic paint material. That's because I set the metallic value to 1, which means it's 100% metallic. The only cases where you would have a value in between was if there is a metal material that's, for example, it's starting to rust or oxidate, it would perhaps have a middle ground value, but for the most part, you want to keep this value either at 0 or 1. Next, I'm just going to jump quickly between the different channels that we baked, just so you can see at least the ones we're going to export into Pixeltope, which is, sorry, it's a base color. I'm just going to delete this extra texture, the base color, which is the color values. And like I said, the height value will be combined into the final normal map. The roughness, which defines how rough a material is at any point on the surface. The metallic, which defines the metallic value. As you can see, it's almost all metallic except for the part with the dirt and the grime. Then you have the normal, just give it a second to load there. Let's see, normal plus height mesh, which combines the height plus the normals. Okay, so to get this into Pixeltope, we can select File and then Export Textures, and we can create an export preset. This is not specific to Substance Painter, once again, but what's important to do when you export your assets is to optimize it a little bit in terms of file usage. And we can actually pack multiple texture maps into one file. And how we do this is that we have, let's see, I'm just going to duplicate this one. Let's see, duplicate. We have the base color, which is taking, of course, the RGB channels to create the colors, and perhaps we can include the alpha if we need to. And then we want to create a texture map that has the RGB value split, so we can put multiple maps into one. And for our style guide, what we use is that we have the metallic value in the red channel. So I'm dragging the metallic value here. We have the roughness value in the green channel. And then we have the ambient occlusion in the blue channel. And this creates a texture map that's has a prefix of MRAO, metallic roughness ambient occlusion. This basically allows us to bring in one single file that has 3 texture maps instead of 1. So already you are dealing with a lot less files, and it's also easier for Unreal to handle. So let's say that we have all of this exported. Let's close Substance Painter and jump into Pixeltope. Let's find director and open up the Pixeltope exterior example again. Give it a second to load. All right, here we are. So now that we are inside the editor again, let's bring in our StudioLite asset that we just looked at. So following once again our style guides and project structure, I'm going into the project name and a folder called art, and this is where all the models will exist. I'm going to go into props because this is a small prop, and I'm going to create a new folder called StudioLite. You can see it's already here, but there's no assets existing there. So I'm going to bring in my assets by finding the FBX. So I'm going to bring in this asset right here by dragging it in. And you don't really have to worry too much about these settings when importing. The most important ones is this one that's called combine meshes. And it basically means that if your FBX has multiple elements inside it or multiple meshes inside it, you can choose to combine all of them into one asset. If you untick it, Pixel will import all of those different models as a separate static mesh. But for this, we want to combine them into one because this is just a small prop. You want to make sure you import the normals and make sure that you select do not create materials because we're going to use materials already existing inside the projects. Do not import the textures because we're going to import them manually. So you can either hit import or import all. If you have multiple FBXs that you're going to bring in at once, you can hit import all and you will bring in all of them at once. But it's just one asset. I'm going to hit import and bring it in. There it is. We're getting a notification that no smoothing group information was found in the FBX. And this is just something specific to Blender. Not to worry, still going to look correct. And now that I'm connected to source control, I can right click, go to source control and mark for add. And it's now marked for add and I can submit it when I'm finished with it. If I jump into the assets, you can see that we have our nice StudioLite model available with one material slot. Speaking of materials, in our style guide, we have material library as a separate folder over here under the project name. And this is where we place something called master materials. Master materials are basically templates with all the functions that you want to have inside the materials, but they actually don't apply to any of the assets. So if you jump into the most common one, which is the MRAO material, this is the master material for most of the common surfaces. And this basically defines the functions that you need inside that. And then you can expose the various parameters that you want the artist to actually tweak when we create something called a material instance. So we have the master material. You shouldn't duplicate master materials. There should be one master material. If you need a specific master material that's doing something specific, you can create a version of that, but you only need one master material for this specific function. In this case, it's the most common surfaces, MRAO. So you can right click on the master material and choose create material instance, which will create a material instance from that master material. Once again, sticking to our naming conventions is MI, then let's call it StudioLite _ Fresnel, because it's a Fresnel type light. Add that, and I'm going to drag this one into my StudioLite folder because following our style guides, the material library should only include the master materials as well as the utility textures. And all material instances should exist within the asset folders themselves. So if I go back into my StudioLite folder and open up this material instance, you can see it looks very different. This one is actually set up to work with our weather system, so it has a bunch of different parameters exposed to it. But let's hide those and pretend they are not there. And this is the more common parameters that you would tweak in a material instance. So the reason why I use material instance is because they are way easier on performance. you get way less draw calls on the material instance, and they are also you can also tweak those materials in real time without having to compile the material every time. So I'm going to apply this material to my studio light by going into the asset. By the way, if you add the asset to the scene, there it is. You can also add the material to the element over here, but keep in mind this will only add it for this level. If you go into the asset, drag material over, it will add it inside the asset itself. Okay, so now that we have the material applied to it, let's import the textures that we exported, or we pretended that we exported from Substance Painter. So I'm just going to drag in. You can see here we have the diffuse, the emissive material, the MRAO material, and the normal map. So I'm just going to drag this in. And you're not going to get any options when importing textures. They're just going to import straight in. So let's also add these for source control. And make sure that we save everything. Important to remember to save. And if I jump into one of these texture files, you can see that we have some settings. The most important one is the compression setting. This one defines how Unreal is going to compress the texture file. And for a base color map, the default compression is what you want to use. But for something like the normal map, you would of course, use a compression setting of normal map. And Unreal is very good at detecting a normal map and setting the compression setting automatically. So it usually will do that for you, so you don't have to worry about it. But if it doesn't, then you can just select it in the list and choose normal map. It's a little bit different when it comes to the MRAO materials. Textures. This one, as you remember, is split into the various channels, where we have the metallic map on the red channel, the roughness on the green channel, and the ambient occlusion on the blue channel. And because of these are the color channels applied together, it starts to look a bit strange, and it can sometimes confuse Unreal into thinking that this is a normal map because of the way it looks with the different colors. If that's the case, don't worry about it, just change it. And for something like this, we should set it to masks, which basically says no compression, because we don't want any compression on these black and white maps. Set it to masks, save. And let's jump into our material. Once again, let's hide all of these. And we can apply our texture maps. Let's see, I'm gonna make some more room here. I'm gonna apply the diffuse map to the diffuse slot. Just gonna enable all of this quickly. There we go. Diffuse to diffuse, emissive to emissive, MRAO to metallic roughness occlusion, and normal map to the normal map. And now, as you can see, we now have our textured assets rendering beautifully with all the physical parameters inside material. Very cool stuff. We also have a little emissive texture that's not actually showing because the emissive value is currently 0. If I set this to 1, you can see we have emissive values. If I crank this up even more, like this, and then make sure that I go into director and enable bloom, you can get some nice bloom from this emissive value. And you can once again see when I'm tweaking it in real time, you don't have to compile the material. I can also use these various parameters to tweak various settings, such as the color. You can tint it to be a red color, for example. And this doesn't work very well with a prop like this, where you only have one material with all the surfaces baked into one texture. But I will show you now how these values apply more when you're working with larger assets. So I'm just going to save my stuff, make sure that I check out the files. Close down the editor, yes. I'm going to jump back into Blender again and show another example. Right, so this was a small prop. What about larger assets like this? For something like this, you want to split it up into multiple materials. Not too many, but you want to split it up in terms of what type of materials it is. So for this one, you might want to split it up into the wood on the walls, for example, as one single materials. We'll split it up into the roof. And you want to do this for a number of reasons. One is because that you want to be able to tweak those surfaces when you get the textures and materials set up in Pixscope. And you also want to make sure that these large surfaces can receive enough resolution. Because if this house only had one material, even if you had a 4K texture, it would probably not be enough to get close without the texture getting blurry. So this is how you would want to split it up. And also, for a big asset like this, you might also want to include light maps. So if I just split this and jump into the UV editor, just quickly check. You can see that we have all the UVs for the various materials, which looks like they are a big mess right now because there are multiple materials on top of each other. But if I split this up by, sorry, I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. Let's just give it a minute to figure that out. I think I'm just gonna close Blender. See, that was my bad. I tried to split it up based on the various different elements in the asset instead of materials, which I was supposed to do. And since there are a lot of elements in that asset, it kind of froze the software, but that's fine. We'll bring it up again. Make sure now to see. I'm going to split it up by material. And you can see when I jump, let's see, let's split this view again. I jump into the UV editor. I have this wall selected, and you can see that it's only the clean UVs with no overlap on the walls. So if we combine all this back like it was originally, we go into the UV slots, you can see we have multiple UV slots. So if I select all of it, you can see it's overlapping. It doesn't seem like it has any light maps right now. Probably doesn't because this asset was not prepared with light maps, but let's see how we create ones. So these are the UVs for the textures. I can duplicate that UV set by hitting this plus icon. I can select all of them and pack the islands to make sure that there is no overlap and everything is nice and clean. So you can see we still have the original UVs intact in this slot, but we have the new light maps contained in its one specific UV slot. And this, like I said, this does, with materials where you see where the UVs overlap, this doesn't really matter because it's split up into different materials and the textures that you apply only are specific to that material. All right, so let's go back into the editor again and bring up the Pixscope exterior. All right, here we are back. So, like I briefly mentioned earlier, it makes more sense to be able to tweak more of these parameters for a larger prop like that house, where you can, for example, tweak things like color and tint the color. For this, it doesn't work because, once again, it's just one single texture. But if you split up your assets, specifically the larger ones, into multiple, they will be easier to tweak directly inside Unreal without having to re-export the textures and make the changes inside a third-party software. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about texture specifics. So we have something called inside Unreal, we have something called Power of 2 mode and MIP mapping. And what this basically does is a level of detail system for your textures. So MIP mapping allows you to make sure that when you move far away from a texture, they no longer render in full resolution and thereby optimizing it. And this works kind of the same way as you would do a level of detail degrade of a static mesh. And when it comes to importing textures into Unreal, it's a little bit picky. You need to make sure that it's the Power of 2 mode, which basically means that it needs to abide the texture resolution with the Power of 2, meaning that you can have either, like this, you have, what do you call it? Yeah, basically, like textures are usually like 1024 to 1048, 4096, and 8192, for example. So it's kind of Power of 2 is doubling it every time. And Unreal is kind of picky about this. If you bring in a texture that's not these dimensions, it might start to complain a little bit. So yes, let's talk about how we can break up this. If you have a large surface for something like this cobblestone floor, you can see that this is a very generic cobblestone texture. And for a large surface, you usually want to tile that to make sure that you get enough resolution. But that's going to look very repetitive. So you can do a little bit of set dressing in order to split this up. So I'm actually going to give this a bit more size here so you can see this a little bit better. And we can use something called decals. So decals allows you to add more surface onto already existing materials. And you can use this to do more set dressing in your scene and break up repetitive textures. Let's see, we can grab this one, such as these stripes over here. Very cool stuff. All right. Just gonna check my notes here to see if I've forgotten anything. Okay, so I think we are ready to move into the Q&A, but before that, I have one single, actually I have two quick tips I can show you before we jump into the Q&A. And one is the fact that you can go into the view options where you have control over the different sizes of the thumbnails. You can also jump into thumbnail edit mode and edit thumbnails themselves. For example, for the static mesh, if I want this one to display as I can rotate this around and give it a thumbnail based on the angle of my choice. For the material, I can do the same thing, and I have the added option of changing out the static mesh. It's sorry, not the static mesh, but the primitive object it's applied to, if you so choose. And then when you're done, you can just hit done editing, and you have your new thumbnails available. And one final quick tip that I'm going to show you before we jump into the Q&A is that Unreal by default does not allow you to import 8K textures. And I can demonstrate this by going into Material Library and Textures, and you can see we have a black 8K texture here that I just made for just test this out, which actually it's already enabled in this project, but I'll show you how you actually enable this. You can see that I have imported an 8K texture and it's displaying the 8K texture. By default, you would still have imported the 8K texture, but it would display as a 4K texture because that's the max limit that Unreal allows by default. And how you change this is that you need to locate your Pixotope. Let's see, that's not this one. Locate your Pixotope installation under Future Group, Pixotope Suite, Pixotope Editor, Engine, and Config, and locate the file called base device profiles.ini and copy that file. Then you can locate your project. I'm just quickly going to find it here. Let's see, I think I already have it. Here we go. Find your project, paste it in, and rename it to default device profiles.ini, and go down to where you find the texture LED groups and set the max LED size to 4,000. No, sorry. By default, it's set to 4096, but you want to set it to 8K, which is 8192. Save that, restart your editor, and you now can import and display 8K textures. You're welcome. So with that, I think we've covered all the topics that we're supposed to cover today. We'll jump into the Q&A, and you know the drill. We are going to take a 5-minute break to allow you all to collect your questions and get those written down and just take in what you've just learned. So it's currently 5:59. We'll take a 5-minute break and come back at 6:04. And I hope that you all have some very exciting questions that we can answer when we come back. And we are back. I'm just going to give you one more minute to gather around, make sure that you have all of those questions written down, and we'll go through them. Okay, so let's jump into the questions. Number one, could you send the vendor spec sheet along with the recording of the session? Absolutely. We'll make that available at the same place as we did with the the set reconstruction PDF that we shared. And of course, you will also get the recording. And another one, could you also send the vendor spec sheet along with the recording of the session? Yes, of course. Next question, can you add a different source control system, for example, Perforce and SVN, and use them at some time? I guess you mean use them at the same time. I'm not actually sure if you can use them at the same time, but yeah, there are multiple versions of source control supported, such as Perforce, SVN, and Git. But any source control system that has a plugin compiled for Pixdope should basically work. Next question. Not really a question, but it's more of a observation. The sync is so much better today. Thank you. Could it be the keystroke display? Might be. I'm not sure why the keystroke display didn't work properly today, but we're glad to hear that you had a much better experience today with the sync. We haven't had time to diagnose what was causing the sync issues that some people were experiencing yesterday. But since it only affected some viewers, we suppose it might be something downstream. Next question. How do you make a custom thumbnail for the assets in Unreal? I'm actually not sure if this is possible, but maybe one of my colleagues would be able to answer that one. Do you have a style guide for the folder structure in Unreal? Yes, we use the style guide based on the LR guide that I showed earlier. I'm going to bring that back up again. Let's say LR style guide. This is a very good starting point. And you can find basically a bunch of different style guides online. Just make sure that when you find one and you decide which one to use, just stick to that one. Don't use multiple style guides, because that would defeat the purpose. Okay, save. Oh, sorry, I'm just messing around inside this. Oops. There we go. Back to the slides. So just curious, what is your modeling software of choice? That would be Blender, like I showcased in this session. I like Blender because it's free and it's very powerful, so definitely recommend that. Do you use a plugin for export for Blender? No, just use the included FBX. Well, I suppose that's a plugin actually, but it's included with Blender, so there's no third-party plugins that I use for exporting FBXs. Okay, so I think that's questions we had time for today. I mean, it was a pretty short session today, but I think since it's Friday, it's good to just let you all go a little bit earlier so you can get on with your day and soon enjoy your nice weekend. So with that, I think we're just going to end this session, and I hope to see you all back on Monday, where I'm going to hand you back over to Frank again, and he's going to talk about scene optimization and lighting. He's going to go through the pixel render pipe and overhead, talk about lighting and shadows in more detail, reflections, and he's going to show you some more of that ray tracing goodness, video playback, and he's also going to show you the process of doing light baking. He's going to finalize and wrap up that session by showing you how you can fix a very bad performing set that has specifically been created to show how bad the performance can get if you don't know what you're doing. So I hope you all come back for that, and I hope you're excited to learn more about that. But for now, I think you all deserve a break, and I hope you all are going to have a very nice weekend, and we hope to see you all again on Monday. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you all again very soon.